In the year 1345, there was a war between the Mongol horde and the Genoese. The Mongol horde had traveled to the port city of Kaffa in modern-day Crimea to take the valuable seaside city. As the battle for the city raged, the Mongol troops, led by the Khan of the Mongol horde, Yani Beg, began to fall ill. One by one, the soldiers began to succumb to the unknown illness. Symptoms included fever, aching joints, nausea, and vomiting. But the oddest symptom of all would be the formation of buboes in the neck, groin, and armpits. So bad was the problem of men dying that the Mongol horde, in a desperate move, catapulted the deceased troops over the city's walls in an attempt to win the battle before all the soldiers died to this mysterious disease. As the disease worsened, the Genoese retreated across the Black Sea to Constantinople. Unbeknownst to everyone, this battle would be the first documentation of one of the worst pandemics in all of human history. By the time of the Siege of Kaffa, Europe was still recovering from a major famine that happened some 30 years before. You see, in 1315 through 1317, there were particularly severe winters, and the effects of which were still being felt in the 1340s. Natural disasters, while still very common today, were more devastating since there was no disaster response and infrastructure. One natural disaster of note came in 1349, the same year the plague struck Italy. It was an earthquake, and at the time it was said to be an act of God and the reason the plague came to Italy. Secondly, during the 14th century, Europe was experiencing a population boom, and cities were overcrowded and poorly maintained. There were few, if any, laws for sanitation in cities, and people often threw their garbage out their windows and onto the streets, and often lived in close proximity to animals like cows, pigs, and horses, as it was a somewhat efficient way to get important supplies without buying them. On top of that, the 100 Years' War was still raging between France and Great Britain. Peasants, who were already living in bad conditions, were increasingly called to fight, and increasingly taxed to pay for the war. Needless to say, by the middle of the 14th century, Europe was already weakened by several factors. Not since the crisis of the 3rd century during the Roman Empire had Europe been so greatly weakened. Thanks to modern analysis, we know that the plague comes from the Yersinia pestis bacteria, and comes in 3 forms: pneumonic, septicemic, and bubonic, and it is the bubonic that is most well known and deadly. As mentioned before, the Siege of Kaffa was the first documented report of the plague, but historians theorize that the Mongols may have first contracted the plague 10 years before, in the 1330s, from China. By the 14th century, the Mongols had control of all of Central Asia, and had set up and perfected what would become known as the Silk Road. This Silk Road revolutionized travel and the transportation of goods, but it also made diseases easier to spread. Although we don't know for certain where the plague originated, we do know that when the Genoese fled across the Black Sea to Constantinople, their ships carried black rats, which in turn carried fleas that harbored the disease. From Constantinople, where the infected Genoese fled, the plague quickly spread, starting in Sicily in October 1347, and by January 1348, the entire Italian peninsula was infected. From Italy, the plague quickly spread, reaching France, Spain, Portugal, and England by June. The plague was so quick and devastating, English historian Geoffrey the Baker wrote, "It came to England and first began in the towns and ports joining the seacoasts. In Dorsetshire, whereas in other countries, it made the country quite void of inhabitants, so there were almost none left alive. But at length it came to Gloucester, yea, even to Oxford and to London, and finally it spread all over England, and so wasted the people that scarce the 10th person of any sort was left alive." The plague then spread through Germany, Scotland, and Scandinavia in 1348. It finally reached Norway in 1349. Africa was also greatly affected by the plague. Some of the worst regions affected included Alexandria, Cairo, Damascus, and Gaza. In the Middle East, Jerusalem, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. Cairo alone had 600,000 casualties to the plague, despite having an advanced hospital for the time. During the height of the plague, it was not uncommon for major cities to lose 50, 60, or even 70% of their population. This was due in part by the lower standards of cleanliness, but also in major cities, people were more crammed together than they are in modern cities. One of the worst hit cities was Florence, Italy. Before the plague, the city boasted a population of around 120,000 people. After the plague, Florence was reduced by 80% to only 24,000 people. It wasn't until the 1800s that Florence finally regained its pre-plague population. Another city that was particularly decimated by the plague was London. At the time of the Black Death, London had a population of 100,000 people. After the plague swept through, it was reduced to 70,000. The plague then returned just a few years later, in 1361, and killed another 20% of London, reducing the population to just 56,000. By 1353, the Great Pestilence, as it was called, finally started to lessen. In the end, some 50 million to 200 million people were dead, and 1 in 3 Europeans had been infected. Some historians say that the Black Death was the catalyst for the Renaissance that followed the Middle Ages, and that because so many people died, it basically ended feudalism in Europe, which was the prominent way of society since the fall of the Roman Empire some 1,000 years earlier, and led to societal, religious, and economic reform. The Black Death changed the way people thought about diseases, and remains the worst pandemic in human history.